the war was over, the job of Reconstruction folk would have challenged even the very greatest of statesmen. The country desperately needed a leader, and unfortunately the leader it got was not the best. And a lot of persons who say maybe Abraham Lincoln was most fortunate at the time of his death. He died right at the height of his, you might say, the height of his glory, the height of his fame. If he had lived, he would have had to face the problem of putting the nation back together again, and he might have gotten himself tainted. In fact, a lot of people said that they believe he might have been impeached because he violated the Constitution on many points. In fact, while he ruled with more authority than any president ever had. He jailed people who disagreed with him. He closed down the right of habeas corpus in the state of Maryland to keep Maryland in the Union. Several things he did that were contrary to the Constitution. Nevertheless, he did not have to live to face the problem of Reconstruction. Now, Abraham Lincoln bind up the nation's wounds. That was his big plan. Abraham Lincoln proposed amnesty to the Confederates who had fought against the Union during the war. No, they will all be forgiven, forgotten about. Unfortunately, with Lincoln gone, a lot of people did not want amnesty. As a for instance, in 1978, Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis were granted citizenship. You hear me? 1978, 110 years after they applied for it. Neither Lee, the old history books say neither Lee nor Davis got their citizenship. Well, they did get it back 110 years later after they applied for it. But the Southern people who had taken arms against the Union were not allowed to vote or hold office. What this meant was that a lot of former slaves held office, and the white people in the South did not like this. Now, the president after Lincoln was Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson was a Tennessean. He'd been governor of Tennessee. You wonder, how did we have a Southerner in the White House? Well, simply this. When all the Southern senators walked out of the Senate, Johnson stayed in his seat. He remained officially a senator throughout the war. Even though his state had left the Union, he was allowed to stay in the Senate, and he voted along with the other senators. Then, because he was so loyal, the Union Party, which was the Republican Party, was called Union Party in 1864. One time only it took that name. But the Union Party got rid of Hannibal Hamlin, Lincoln's first vice, for no reason other than wanted to pick a president who was a Southerner himself. So they picked Andrew Johnson to make the South happy. Andrew Johnson, though, had a very fiery temper, and he was his own worst enemy, really. All right.
So there was no vote, they just made him president?
Well, there was a vote, all right, but here's the thing about the vote. There are 11 southern states who left the Union did not vote. Now, the delegates picked the candidates. This is not true today. Today we have primaries. They didn't have a primary then, so the Union Party met in a convention, and they chose Lincoln. And then the Union Party decided to choose a Southern vice president. The ordinary common people did not vote until it came time for the election in November. But there was no primary. So, but anyway, Lincoln, it was the first time in our history that an election had occurred during the wartime. And we were to have another election during World War II. And another election during Korea, another election in Vietnam. But during the wartime, we had an election, and we tried to satisfy the South, so they elected Andrew Johnson. All right. Johnson had been a Democrat all of his life, but he became a Republican long enough to, well, because he did not believe in secession, did not believe that the states should have left the Union. All right. With the war over, federal troops remained in the South. Now keep this in mind, because a lot of federal troops stayed in the South during the days that the war was over. And this created a real problem because the Southern people did not want them. Now, eventually, the federal troops were removed from the South, but that was to come later. The Reconstruction era involves both the presidency of Johnson and the man who followed him, Grant, which I'll talk about later. Now, the states who had left the Union, the 11 of them, yes?
I'm reading here, it says he was a Democrat. Johnson was a Democrat all his life.
All of his life, but he was elected by the Republican Party, though.
Oh, so, okay,
He still was a Democrat at heart.
All right, okay, so.
Yeah, but he was elected, this is one time where the Republican Party elected a Democrat. He was a Democrat all of his life, but he joined the Union Party or the Republican Party because he could not agree with secession.
Okay.
But yeah, he was, I'm glad I saw that too. He was a Democrat all of his life. Anyway, now, in order to get back in, the states had to ratify the 14th Amendment. Now, there are 3 amendments passed right at this time, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. Amendment number 13 freed the slaves. Abraham Lincoln got this through Congress before he died. And again, he wanted to get it through before the war ended so that the southern states knew that when they came back into the Union, all slaves would be free. And again, this was in part because Abraham Lincoln had promised that he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed. But then came the big war, and he felt like he was forced to break that promise, owing to the fact he needed volunteers for his army, so it became a slave war. Also, he had to keep Great Britain and France off his back because Great Britain had an army in Canada, and France took over Mexico temporarily. They didn't hold on to Mexico. So Britain and France, so Abraham Lincoln changed it into a slave war in order to get Britain and France off his back and in order to get volunteers for his army. So sometimes, folk, and I've learned this the hard way as a young man coaching softball teams, you make a promise to your players, then circumstances change, and in order to be functional, you sometimes have to break it. Right? Just simply circumstances beyond your, even dealing with kids. You sometimes make a promise, then things change. Well, Lincoln had promised during his campaign that he would not interfere with slavery where it already existed, but then came the war, and he felt like he had to. So he pushed for 13. Now, the 13th Amendment was passed. All right, here's the rules. You had to get 2/3 of both houses, and then 3/4 of states. The 11 states who had left the Union did not get to vote on it. The 11 states left the Union did not have their senators and their representatives in the House and Senate. So only the states who were left voted this one in. But the other states who were out of the Union were told, once you come in, you must ratify the 13th Amendment. But then added to the 13th, the 14th Amendment made them citizens. In other words, now this became an issue because President Johnson insisted, and keep in mind, President Johnson was very racist by 2019 standards, and yet he knew what the law was. He insisted that all the states who were coming into the Union, these 11 states would have to agree to the 14th Amendment also. No, not just the freeing the slaves, but making them citizens. Now, yes, there was a 15th Amendment passed later, because some states said, well, they might be citizens, but we're not going to allow them to vote. So the 15th Amendment gave them the right to vote.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
So the states that did leave, in order for them to return back, they had to agree to all of those things?
They had to agree.
In order to come back?
They had to, the 15th Amendment was not up yet, but they had to agree to Amendment 13 and 14. The 15th Amendment came after they had come back. Anyway, the southern states began to send a representative to Congress, but keep in mind, only those persons who had not taken up arms. So a couple of the senators were black, including the man we mentioned at the beginning of the chapter, James Rapier. He was black. The South had a couple of black senators at that time, and in the state houses there were several blacks, former slaves. And again, now I want to talk about the 15th Amendment now. It came a little bit after these other two, but the women were hoping that the 15th Amendment would read that no person would be denied the right to vote on account of sex. What it actually says is no person can be denied the right to vote based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In other words, previous condition of servitude, that's a legalist way of saying even former slaves. So this gave former slaves the right to vote. Now, but the women wanted it to be, particularly Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was pushing for women's rights, wanted it to read not just race or color or previous condition of servitude, but regardless of sex also. When the 15th Amendment was actually ratified by 2/3 of the Congress and 3/4 of states, this was left off. Now, keep in mind, your average Southerner did not get to vote on this because your average Southerner had taken up arms against the United States. So these amendments were passed without the Southern vote. Now, something else I've already mentioned. You might have heard that blacks were not allowed to vote as recently as 50 years ago. I'm old enough to remember when I was a child, most black people in the South did not vote. You might ask, how did they get around the 15th Amendment? All right, here's how. The United States Supreme Court, which was still controlled by this highly racist Justice Taney and several other racist justices, overturned. They couldn't overturn the amendment as such, but they said that the black states could do the Southern could do two things that kept blacks from voting. One, have a poll tax. And the 24th Amendment, which was passed when I was a kid during Kennedy's administration, outlawed the poll tax finally. And the other one was the literacy test. Now, folk, we'd make jokes about it when I was in high school and college. But the literacy test was where you were given a test, and if you passed the test, you could vote. If you didn't pass the test, you could not vote. Anybody know how you passed the test? You had to be white. You had to be white. Excellent. Very good. You had to have white skin. A black man with a PhD failed the literacy test one time, and an illiterate white man who could not read the test passed it. Yes?
So I have a question. So what if you just went all this way to make sure they don't vote? Why even make the 15th Amendment if you knew you
Well, no, the
couldn't
15th
vote?
Amendment was passed largely by the northern states. I'm not talking about, the northern states did give them a right vote, but it was passed by the northern states mostly, and also passed by Southerners who still had the right to vote. So it was passed legally because those states that did not take it up, men like Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis, and they did not have the right to vote. So they had no say-so in the matter. So it was passed legally, and as far as the law that was there, but then see, in a book, the Supreme Court, they can make any decision they want to, even when it's clearly against the letter of the Constitution. Yes?
So they just appointed that guy to be president just to keep him down, just to stay quiet, because you guys have somebody from the South as a president?
What's that? Well, oh, you mean, could the Supreme Court do that?
You talking about Andrew Johnson?
Yeah, just so the people from the South will stay calm. and don't-
That was the reason, a lot of the reason why Andrew Johnson was elected, yes. Even though Hannibal Hamlin, Lincoln's first vice president, was a good man and loyal to Lincoln, did nothing wrong, and but nevertheless, the Union Party, the people at the convention, wanted a man who would placate the South. The Southern states sent 3 delegates, their vice president, 2 other men high up, trying to plead with Mr. Lincoln, we have to have slavery. Please understand, slavery must exist here in the South. He got nowhere. Lincoln would not even meet with them. He knew why they were there, and but basically he even refused to see them. But anyway, 15 now, but folk, again, a point I want to make is our Supreme Court has altogether too much power. Now, eventually, blacks did get the right to vote when all those old justices died off and new justices took their place, and eventually some of their bad decisions get overturned, but it takes, all right, well, we'll talk more later. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that Southern states could have separate facilities for blacks as long as they were equal, separate but equal, 1896. The facilities for blacks were never equal to what there was for whites. That decision was finally overturned in 1954. 1896, 1954, 48 years later. By that time, all the judges who had made the decision in 1896 were deceased and gone. A new generation of judges came on the court that overturned Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. It's rare that the Supreme Court overturns one of its own decisions. All right, so much for the 3 amendments that were passed at this time. Anyway, as a result, the white people in the South began to, you might say, take up arms and terrorize the blacks. An organization was formed called the Ku Klux
Ku Klux Klan. That was the
The Ku Klux Klan patterned itself after a lodge. Now, my wife learned, and that's something that she was never told, but in her research, genealogical research, she learned that her maternal grandfather, her mother's father, had been a Klan member. A lot of young Southern men joined the Klan, and a lot of middle-aged and older Southern men joined the Klan. The Klan's purpose was to terrorize blacks, and keep them in their place. Now again, folk, just to remind you, I don't want to sweep any of this under the rug. This actually happened, and some of you probably already know it, but I want to remind you that this actually went on. And they would get in their white sheets. Sometimes they would lynch. Basically, lynching is, the word lynch means murder for racial reasons. They would lynch blacks who stepped out of line or who went too far. But they were determined that the South was going to remain white supremacist throughout. Now, the Klan was not just anti-black. The Klan was very pro-Protestant. It was, in addition to being anti-black, it was anti-Catholic, much like the Know-Nothing Party of the 1850s, and anti-foreigner. They did not want foreigners in, new foreigners to come in. Now, the thing about the foreigners now, folks, that's one of the questions I'm asking you to write about. That is nothing at all new. Nothing. I mean, we have a big influx of foreigners now. In fact, some of you are probably not American born. That's fine with me, but it's not always fine with everybody. But they do not want foreigners to come in and take up residence, particularly Mexican foreigners and Irish foreigners, especially Catholics. I'll put it in plain language. But they tried hard to keep Catholics out, discourage Catholics from moving into the South, and to keep the black people in their place. Also, they're anti-Jew, anti-foreigner, anti-Catholic, anti-black. And, oh yeah, anti-woman, uppity women, yes, I must mention it. So 5 things. They did not want women to leave their place. Basically, they wanted to make sure that the women stayed at home and did the sewing and the cooking and bearing children, taking care of the children. And they did not want to see women advance into political power. They did not want to see women get the right to vote. Again, each of you can decide for yourself the merits of these issues, but these things came on, and the Klan got its way by intimidation. Now, I'm going to jump around the story a little bit. The Klan became really powerful in the 1870s, and as power declined, then in the 1920s, it reemerged again and became a really strong political power again and stayed strong until the Grand Vizier of the Klan was found to have had an affair with an underage girl. And that did a lot to destroy the prestige of the Klan. In those days, things like this would really destroy not just the person, but the organization. Then the Klan died down in the 30s and 40s, but it came back in the 1960s, and I remember clearly, and a lot of my classmates were in sympathy with it. Because in the 1960s, the blacks began to reassert themselves, and led by Dr. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, we'll talk later, but then the Klan rose up to try to put them down. But to make a long story short, a whole lot of Yankees like myself moved south. And Southern politicians had to change their ways and admit that black people should be allowed to vote. Laws were passed. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed, which and more blacks encouraged other blacks to go register to vote, which they did. I'm saying this, folk, hoping that we can begin to put racism behind us, but not by sweeping it under the rug and acting like it never happened. It did, but also to know how terrible it is and how awful it is, and that we can eventually put it behind us and not bring up issues that should have died 50 years ago or 150 years ago, that should have died and hopefully will die soon. All right. or because there was so much of this going on, President Johnson decided to use the army to impose martial law in the South, a military rule in much of the South. More federal troops moved to the South to try to protect the black minority and to try to make sure that the laws passed by Congress, the freeing of the slaves and making them citizens, was actually carried out. But the Southern people were so strong against it that the revolution that the Civil War tried to bring about did not actually happen. One of the books I used to teach from calls it a reconstruction only half accomplished. In other words, the slaves were freed, yes, but the slaves really did not become citizens and really did not have the right to vote. Thanks in large part to our third branch of government, plus the fact that the people living in these areas simply would not have it. Now, the big problem with Congress, or with Washington, was, and the Constitution did not deal with this, who was in charge of reconstructing the Union once the Union had been torn apart. Congress said, we are. Andrew Johnson said, we are. Andrew Johnson said, I am. And really, it's hard to tell who was right. A man named Thaddeus Stevens and his close friend Charles Sumner Do you know anything about Charles Sumner? We've met him before. What do you remember? If you remember anything about Charles Sumner, last chapter, last class. He was the one who was beaten with a cane, beaten for so badly Now Charles Sumner was beaten by a Southerner, Preston Brooks. Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner believed that the South should be punished. Andrew Johnson wanted to carry on Lincoln's policy. I mean, Lincoln made a speech with malice toward none, with charity for all. Let us bind up the nation's wounds. Andrew Johnson wanted to let the Southern people back in with as conciliatory a tone as possible. Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner said no, the South was at fault in this war. The South was on the wrong side of the issues. Therefore, the South should be punished. Bear with me. Okay. Well, eventually, Congress and the President had a clash. This led to the very first impeachment of a president in our history. Now, I want to clarify something. This is what a lot of students are confused about. The word impeach does not mean you remove the president. Impeachment is done by the House of Representatives. The actual removal is done by the Senate. In order to get a president out of office, the House has to bring the charges, and the House can do it by just a simple majority vote. The Senate then has to approve of the charges by a vote of 2-1 or 2/3 majority. Well, Andrew Johnson was impeached. That is, the House brought charges. Essentially, what the charge was, this Congress passed a law over the president's veto that took from Mr. Johnson the right that every president has to fire the people in the executive department. Now, don't be wrong, the president cannot fire a Supreme Court justice, the president cannot fire a congressman or senator, but the president can fire a secretary of state, anyone in the executive office. He can fire a general, he can fire a member of his own cabinet, or anyone in the executive bureaucracy. Well, the Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act, which said that everyone who had an office had the right to keep it and the president could not remove him. Johnson did not believe this act was right, and Johnson learned that one member of his cabinet was a spy telling the Congress everything that went on in the cabinet meetings. Johnson fired that cabinet person. Now, the Tenure of Office Act had not specified that Johnson could not remove a cabinet official. Nevertheless, they charged President Johnson with high crimes and misdemeanors, which is what the Constitution cause for impeachment. When it came to an actual trial in the Senate, Johnson was not removed from office by one vote. But he was crippled at that point. Now, the impeachment trial occurred in 1868, and while it was going on, the Republican Party met and nominated Ulysses Grant to be its president. Now, I'm going to elaborate a little more on impeachment because it's somewhat of a current issue. Our present president, there are calls to impeach him. But the impeachment was not done for the longest of time. It wasn't done again because it proved to be so impossible. After all, Andrew Johnson was a very unpopular president. And Andrew Johnson's law said, listen, if you'll keep quiet, just keep your mouth shut, we'll take care of it for you. And again, I've got to be careful because our present president maybe finally learned to keep his mouth shut too. But anyway, leaving that, but a lot of times a person's tongue can get him into more trouble than he can get out of. But Johnson kept quiet, and Johnson did not defend himself. His attorneys did that for him. John Kennedy later wrote a book, Profiles in Courage, in which he describes a senator named Ross who committed political suicide by voting for Johnson to stay in office. And he was called, because a lot of people, particularly in the North, wanted Johnson removed. But make a long story short, Johnson was not removed from office. Now, fast forward, we've only had 2 presidents that were actually impeached. Their names are Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. What about Richard Nixon? Richard Nixon was not impeached. Now, Richard Nixon, late in his term, realized that he only had 10 or 15 senators who'd vote with him, and then rather than make the country go through impeachment, he resigned. So he was never impeached. No charge about it. The House was about ready to, but a bunch of senators, including Senator Goldwater and Senator Baker, went and talked to him and persuaded him to resign. They said that, you don't have the votes, Mr. President. And so he resigned. He was never impeached. Bill Clinton was, but when it came to voting in the Senate, there was not 2/3. There was not 67 senators who would vote for removal. So Bill Clinton was not removed from office. So the 2 presidents who were impeached, Andrew Johnson, Bill Clinton, Richard Nixon is the only one who resigned. All right. Oh yes, something else, but in those days, there was no vice president. I mean, the office was there, but we didn't have the 25th Amendment, so Johnson did not get to appoint a vice president. So the office of vice president was vacant. That meant that a senator would become president. The president pro tem of the Senate would become president. And he stood up and he said, I promise. I mean, he would take over if Johnson was impeached. He said, I promise to keep a fair hearing. And he voted to remove the president from office. I mean, he was obviously voting for himself. But nevertheless, Johnson was not removed. All right. Removed from the impeaching the president, the 15th Amendment, which I've talked about, and women's demands. A lot of women were hoping that the 15th Amendment would include women's right to vote along with the blacks' right to vote. It did not. The 15th Amendment, though, did give black people, former slaves, the right to vote. It created a whole lot of turmoil in the South, a whole lot of struggles and a whole lot of bloodshed. And to make a long story short, 100 years after it was passed, black people finally got the right to vote. But it took quite some doing. Now, into the South, about this time, there came a whole lot of northern people. They were called, some of them were called carpetbaggers. Knowing that southern people, most of them did not have the right to vote anymore, these northern people would move, and some of them were so poor that they put all their possessions in a bag and carried the bag on a stick. That's where the name carpetbagger. They came to the South and they tried to set themselves up as politicians. northern men taking up residence south and trying to get themselves elected to southern state houses. These carpetbaggers were desperately hated. Some Southerners, the Southerners who had not taken up arms, therefore who had the right to hold office, they were called scalawags.